Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever it is you happen to be. Hope you guys are having a great day as always. But my objective today is to wholly depress you. And we're going to do that because we have to speak about the Great Depression. Now, the Great Depression is one of these iconic moments in U.S. history, but understand that this depression is not just a U.S. phenomenon. It will, in fact, touch off the economies in a number of different countries around the world. And indeed, when we begin to think about the causes of World War II, one of those, of course, is the Great Depression, because there are a number of countries who are suffering economically. They have little to no food. Jobs are scarce. And in places like Germany, there is what we call hyperinflation. Where effectively their money became absolutely worthless. But at least we get ahead of ourselves. The traditional story as it goes, as you're taught in junior high and high school about the Great Depression, is that the central cause for that depression was the crash of the stock market, which took place on October 29, 1929, a day forever known as Black Tuesday. Now, it is true that Black Tuesday touched off the Great Depression. One thing you do need to be aware, however, is that the economy had actually begun to move into a recession a few or so months before the stock market actually crashed. So, in fact, the real economy in the United States had actually begun to cool before the stock market ever collapsed. But it is the stock market that touches the whole thing off. But it is too simplistic to say that the Great Depression was caused by the crash of the stock market. There are a number of underlying reasons, interrelated reasons for why the stock market crashed. In just sort of quick succession, one of the things that was very true during the 1920s is that industrial output in the United States was monumental. The United States produced, I think, upwards to 50% of the world's manufactured industrial goods. And so what that means is that the United States is overproducing. They are creating an immense amount of materials for people to buy. But of course, basic economics kicks in and it states supply and demand, right? If your demand begins to diminish, then you have way more supply than you need. And if you have too much supply, then what you end up doing is laying folks off because, in fact, you no longer need them to produce the goods that they had once been doing. Dr. Foner writes the following: the once roaring economy had actually begun to fall into recession because of overproduction and underconsumption, which is what I just stated. It says during the 20s, manufacturing production increased 43%, but the purchasing power of consumers did not grow nearly as fast. In essence, the economy was turning out more products than consumers could buy, and too many people had been borrowing too much money for unproductive purposes. That is, they are borrowing money to buy things that they don't need or to invest in stock market speculation. And you have to understand that if there's simply too many goods in the market, but there's not enough people to buy those goods, that's going to force the market to cool down. People are going to be laid off, and therefore they're going to have even less money with which to purchase goods. The other thing that you need to be aware of is that there is definitely an uneven distribution of wealth going on. Companies and corporations were making money hand over fist, but what they were not doing was raising the salaries or the wages of their workers. Instead, what they were doing is they were putting those wages, those profits back into their company in order to grow the company. Again, Dr. Foner states at the same time, many business owners had taken large profits while denying wage increases to employees. By plowing profits into executive salaries, stock dividends, and business expansion, employers created an imbalance between production and consumption. Because union membership had plummeted, organized labor no longer exerted control. 2/3 of families in 1929 earned less than $2,000 annually. And a living wage, if that term would have been used at that time, you needed to make somewhere between $2,000 to $2,500 a year. And yet you've got about 65 or so percent of the population that makes well underneath that amount of money per year. And so they don't have the money with which to buy these goods. Companies are overproducing goods. The farm sector, for example, had plummeted in the United States at this time. During World War I, there was a great need for American commodities, particularly in the agricultural sector, because European countries couldn't produce those goods. They were fighting the war, so they were importing a lot of American farm products. And so what the farmers did is they took out massive mortgages in order to continue to meet the demand. Well, after World War I, those demands fell off and the agricultural sector stagnated, right? Other issues that caused the that caused the Great Depression. You had banks lending money out to people as if it were candy that was, about to expire, and they needed to get rid of it. There was no FDIC backing. There was no protection or insurance on your money. And so if the bank ran out of money at any point, you're just out of luck. And so the banks are lending out money. But perhaps the biggest problem that would contribute to the coming of the Great Depression was stock market speculation and buying stocks on margin. I'm trying to get to my page here. Basically, when you buy a stock, obviously the basic principle of buying stocks is when the price of the stock is low, you buy, and when it's high, you sell. The value of a stock is predicated on the amount of money that's actually in the market. So if a stock value says that a share of, Amazon stock is worth $500 a share, then for that stock value to actually be worth $500 a share, you need people to actually pay $500 per share, and then the value of the stock would increase. What was happening in the 1920s, is that people were buying stocks on margin. And buying stocks on margin is kind of like paying for something with a credit card. What folks would do is they would begin to see that a certain stock was rising in value. And so, of course, they want to get in on this because they want to make money. So what they do is they would borrow upwards to 75% of the stock's value, but they themselves would only pay in maybe 25, 30% of the value of the stock. And so what happens is the value of the stock on paper looks like the value is going up and up and up and up. But the reality is that you haven't actually pumped that same amount of money into the market, right? It says what made it so easy for so many to invest in stocks was the common practice of buying on margin. That is, an investor could make a small cash down payment, which would be the margin, on shares of stock and borrow the rest from a bank or a stockbroker who held the stock certificates as security in case the share price plummeted. And that's what happened in 1929 on October 29th. All of these people who had all this money wrapped up in stocks, the value of the stocks began to plummet and there was nobody there to buy them. And so the Great Depression kicks in. That's kind of a quick and dirty of the causes. And of course, the consequences of the Great Depression were significant. There was a lot of social consequences, cultural consequences, economic consequences, and political consequences. At the time that the Great Depression started, the United States had just elected Herbert Hoover into office. And by all measures, Herbert Hoover would have made a very perfect president had it not been for the Great Depression. And the reason for it is that Herbert Hoover was an old-line Republican who thought that the government should not interfere in the market economy. In other words, when the Great Depression happened, Herbert Hoover didn't immediately jump on board the philosophy that the government should give you jobs, that the government should give you money. In fact, there was this idea that if you did that, then really you would just be coddling folks and they would become lazy. That was the philosophy. And there might be some merit to that. There might not be some merit to that. But when we're talking about upwards to over 30% unemployment rate, you got to do something. Herbert Hoover's philosophy was known as voluntarism. He encouraged businesses not to fire people, but rather to reduce their hours, to reduce their pay, make sure that they have something. But the reality is that within this particular economic moment, voluntarism wasn't going to work. And people began to lose their jobs, they lost their money, they lost their homes, divorce rates skyrocketed, prostitution rates increased, abandonment rates of children increased. one of the major social consequences was that a major punch was felt by the male sector of society, because at the time, men were supposed to be the breadwinners, right? They'd bring home the bacon. And they couldn't do that anymore. And so part of who they were and part of what made them feel accomplished is now gone. And so they begin to ride the rails. We called them hobos or tramps. They're selling pencils. They're selling apples, trying to make a life for themselves. And oftentimes Herbert Hoover gets criticized for not having done anything to help. He was slow to move, but he did attempt to do some things. At one point, he implements a tariff, or he supports the implementation of a tariff. Over 1,000 economists told him not to do it. They said it would damage the economy even further. He didn't listen, and in fact, the economists were right, but he was trying to do something. He tended to give business breaks to high corporations, believing in something known as the trickle-down effect, the idea that if businesses have tax breaks, if businesses do well, then the profits made by the business will trickle down to the rest of society. One might argue, if that's true, then there shouldn't have been an unequal distribution of wealth to begin with. But nonetheless, Herbert Hoover attempts to do a few things, but he doesn't get much done, and he loses the confidence of the American people, particularly after an event that took place in 1932, 33, somewhere around there, known as the Bonus Army March, where basically a bunch of World War I vets who had been promised a bonus, they came to Washington. They demanded that the bonus be paid out. Herbert Hoover, among others, believed that most of the people were made up of communists and socialists and what have you, and anarchists, and so they were basically removed by force. And this, of course, is going on during the middle of an election. Socially speaking, people are just trying to get by. One of the sectors of the American economy that actually doesn't take a hit as much as it could have was that of the film industry. People could go to a film, see a double feature for fairly cheap and just forget their sorrows for a while before they had to go back to their Hooverville. And a Hooverville is basically a collection or a community of shacks, right, where basically homeless folk lived. But by 1933, 32, it was very clear that Herbert Hoover wasn't going to be able to get the job done. He is nominated by the Republican Party to run for a second term. He will lose to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt will become president from 1933 until 1945. He's the only president ever to hold 4 terms. He died at the start of his 4th. But FDR attempted to address the Great Depression by implementing what he called a New Deal. And the New Deal, historians refer to it as his alphabet soup program, because he created, along with Congress, and note, Congress has a lot to do with this, they created a bunch of agencies like the Tennessee Valley Authority and the CCC, among others. And really what they were trying to do was to implement agencies and organizations that could help with reform, recovery, and, there's a third R there. Reform, recovery, and I can't remember the third one off the top of my head, but they were attempting to address these issues. So let me give you a big for instance. One that is still with us today, and that would be Social Security, right? The Social Security Act was actually passed during Franklin Delano Roosevelt's second New Deal, and basically it was intended to help the elderly. Really what you found here is that this is a time where we are trying to help people in the immediate sense, right? So we're trying to help you now, but it's also had a long-lasting effect in that it's still with us. So that is an example of reform. So at any rate, oftentimes Franklin Roosevelt is known for having ended the Great Depression, which isn't really true. One of the things that Franklin Roosevelt does that Herbert Hoover didn't do is that he made the Great Depression more palatable for people. That is, he helped you to be able to tolerate it in a way that Herbert Hoover couldn't have done. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt, when he got his inauguration, he said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And when you confront that kind of fear, when you confront those kinds of problems, what you need to do is try something, right? Herbert Hoover wasn't trying much of anything. FDR was going to try something. Did it work? Not necessarily. Franklin Roosevelt doesn't get us out of the Depression. The New Deal doesn't necessarily get us out of the Depression. Unemployment's still fairly high. What gets us out of the Depression is World War II. But there are major consequences of the Great Depression, and some of those were positive. I mean, if you have a bank account, you have FDIC backing, insurance on your money. And the reason for that is because when the Great Depression hit, there was a run on the banks. And when people showed up, the banks were simply lending out all the money, giving out all the money. And if they had lent money out for loans, which they had been doing, then there wasn't any money left. And so you just lost it. It's an interesting moment in our history. And in many ways, by studying the Great Depression, we learn not only about that time period, but I think many of the causes for the Great Depression were very similar to that which caused the housing bubble to crash in 2007 and 2008. And so, there's a lot of similarities there. Oftentimes, people talk about the economy as going through boom and bust cycles, and that's definitely true. But we definitely want to learn from the past and see what we can do to hopefully ensure that that never happens again. So that's what we've got for today. Hopefully the rest of this week's materials will be helpful and interesting to you. Otherwise, as always, go in peace, be warm and filled, may the force be with you, live long and prosper, and may the odds forever be in your favor. Have a blessed week, guys.